Good evening. Tonight, while the world seemed to be going mad over the Trump-Zelensky pissing contest, nobody seemed to notice that the first private commercial lunar lander successfully touched down on the moon. Guess which story we will be talking about? Rocket Lab announces a new flatellite, they call it, designed for mass production of large constellations. And finally, today, we want to talk about how the past may become prologue for the future space economy with a guest who literally wrote the book about the shipping container, the cornerstone of the global economy here on Earth. From the news desk at the Center for Space Commerce and Finance, my name is Thomas Andrew Olson, and this is The Unknown Quantity. I know we've asked this before, but I'm going to answer it again. What is the Center for Space Commerce and Finance? Well, we champion and strengthen emerging space startups, space scalable SMBs, and space adjacent enterprises worldwide through advisory, access, and advocacy across the funding spectrum. Our programs fortify business plans and investor readiness for founding teams at various levels of development. One of our latest initiatives, of course, is our monthly space microgrants, where we award $1,000 to an aspiring startup each month. If you want to apply for the microgrant, the form is there on the page, and it's very easy to submit. We also encourage our listeners and fans to help support our microgrants. So at the bottom of that page is a link button to the support page where you get the option of a one-time gift or a monthly subscription. $550 to $100 a month for 6 months or more helps a lot of new firms get out of the garage. Now, joining me is one of my favorite podcast producers, entrepreneur, one of my oldest space friends, Michael Lane from Liftport. Michael, I know you're there somewhere. There he is, man. Oh, God, good seeing you, man. Yeah, always lots of stuff going on. Lots of stuff. I love that Firefly aced it, their lunar landing. They just stuck it and won. Right? That was just absolutely amazing. I guess, and I'm willing to bet that it lasts longer than they say it's going to. They say it's only for a 2-week mission. They're going to go for an entire lunar day and try to capture some images of what a lunar sunset looks like. Mm-hmm. And they brought 10 instruments with them, and they're doing various measurements. But hey, for all I know, this thing will end up like the Curiosity rover or something. It could be there for years, sending stuff and going. That would be absolutely great. That'd be icing on the cake.
Well, we don't yet know what a lunar like, but that's a heck of a picture. That little pale blue dot back there is us. This is their first stunning view from the moon. So good job, folks. Pretty excited about that. And the crazy thing is, we're going to have this exact same conversation on Thursday when we go back to the moon. So that's wild.
Right. Another company is trying to land their own spacecraft on the moon. Thursday.
There. Okay. Yeah.
Now this is as if we didn't have enough things going on in the world of constellations. Rocket Lab seems to have upped the ante. They've come up with this new form factor they call a flatellite, and it has nothing to do with flatulence. It's a very flat form factor, like a 1U form factor, and with the solar panel sticking out. But they say they can manufacture these in a standardized form much faster, and put out more stuff. Now, I don't know what that means for current providers of constellation services. I doubt that Elon Musk is going to say, okay, all my next Starlinks are going to look like this.
Right.
But I guess if you're looking to do your own constellation in the future, you've got something else to look at.
I think this is a really interesting move, right? They're calling it Flatellite. I'm calling it IKEA-sat, but it's the idea that you can, if you build with a different architecture, all of a sudden you can put more stuff on that thing. So you can see this thing is just nice and flat, and you can stack them all the way up. And I think that is going to be a really revolutionary form factor. In the same way that the CubeSat form revolutionized space.
Yeah.
A lot of people that are new to this think that we always had the CubeSat, but the CubeSat's, I think it was invented about 20 years ago, but it didn't pick up speed and real adoption until about 10 years ago. And it's only been in the last 5 years that they've really, really proven themselves as workhorses in the mostly in the academic community. But there's fourth grade classes building mock-up satellites now.
Well, sure. But what I was going to mention, one of the reasons that they caught on so much was simply 3D printing.
Mm-hmm. That's
what really made that industry fly.
So, so you've got this rocket lab that, you could argue that they are a SpaceX competitor. They certainly think so.
Absolutely.
And they're saying, look, SpaceX has done well by billions of dollars of fresh revenues from their satellite constellation, Starlink. So why can't we do that? And so, in one sense, they're going to go out and build their own systems. But I think the more interesting element is this idea of standardization, that they're going to create a new form factor, like the CubeSat was a new form factor, that's going to make operational development easier for all the other groups out there that are trying to figure out what to send to space. So I think it's going to be really interesting. It's a somewhat revolutionary, somewhat bold decision, and I think it's a really smart one. So I'm curious to see where that plays out.
Yeah. Now, I understand you told me before the show you had a couple of things you wanted to talk about regarding containerization or something.
Well, right. We're going to talk to our guest here in a minute, but I want to kind of set the stage for him. Let me show you first this image, this video.
Attention all flight crew members, the flight is go for launch.
It's been just, goal is to get that turnaround time down to hours.
We have liftoff.
It's been just over a month since Flight 5. Goal on time down to hours.
So I played that twice, that one piece. I'm sure everybody who's watching the show has their own favorite clips of Starship. This is SpaceX's sizzle reel for Starship 6, and it was interesting because that one line, it's just over a month since they launched number 5 to number 6, just over a month, and they want to get down to hours. So imagine a world where this gigantic machine flies on a regular basis every few hours. Added to that, SpaceX, I don't think I have the clip up here, but SpaceX just announced that they're going to set up a new Starship launch and retrieval site in Florida. So that'll be their second one. They have to, right? Because they're going to get bogged down at Boca Chica. So, these two facts of goals to get down to hours and delivery and multiple launch and retrieval sites, it's a pretty big deal. And I want you to kind of like hang on to that hours sentence that they had in that video, because I want to add one more piece to it, which is right here. This one is a game changer, y'all. We've been watching the Air Force and Air Force Research Labs step-by-step progression for developing, this optimism around Starship, but also this piece. They're picking a new site out deep in the Pacific, not far from Hawaii in relative terms, this rocket cargo program. Now, they've been at this for about 4 years now. This is the first step in point-to-point suborbital. And so for the folks that don't fully understand that, that means launching, whether it's from Texas or Florida, letting the world spin underneath you, and then coming down in Tokyo 45 minutes later. That's kind of what we're talking about, right? Go up suborbitally and come down somewhere else, whether it's Florida where Tom is, or Seattle where I am. Easy hops all around the globe, quickly and simply. And so the Air Force Research Lab has been pioneering this for about 4 years now. We had Colonel Nirav Lad on our show about 4 years ago, talking about the kind of first inception of this. But what's happened now is they've picked a piece of real estate out in the Pacific, this atoll here, and they're going to have rocket landings. I don't think anything's going to launch there. That seems unrealistic. But they're going to have delivering critical supplies to any point on Earth within hours. This is a real thing, right? And so if you couple the idea of flat packed cargo and containerization and systemization with flights every few hours with point-to-point cargo, nobody's talking about people yet. That actually is a bridge still a little too far. But they looked at places that were remote, water all around it, low population. What happens if they crash land, because that would be bad for everybody. So it's 700 miles out from Hawaii, middle of nowhere. We used to do nuclear testing there. I think that's pretty wild. And then re-entry capsules. By the way, Varda just had their first re-entry capsule come down to Australia this week also. So while everybody else was watching the kerfluffle in the White House, in the Oval Office this week, we were watching that point-to-point cargo is being developed near Hawaii, and cargo re-entry is starting to happen out in Australia. So lots of interesting stuff there. Lots of interesting stuff. And on that note,
let's get to our main story of the day. I'm going to start by, in way of introduction of our guest, I'm going to start with a repeating a little bit of history of our own here. And I think this is going to be hopefully fascinating to our viewers, because we're going to get a deep dive into the background of how basically the global economy got started and what the lessons we can learn from that moving ahead when we start building an interplanetary economy out there in the high frontier in 3 dimensions. But let's start with this. On April 26, 1956, a crane lifted 58 aluminum truck bodies aboard a refitted oil tanker in Newark, New Jersey, called the Ideal X. Now, 5 days later, the Ideal X sailed into Houston, where 58 trucks were waiting to haul the metal boxes to their destinations. That was the beginning of a revolution that made the global trade boom possible. Before the container ship revolution, the high cost of moving goods was a major impediment to global trade. The container, a simple and entirely soulless steel box held together with welds and rivets, changed all that, driving down transportation costs and in the process reshaping economic geography. A book called The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger, and Michael has it right there. It tells the dramatic story of the creation of that container and the decade of struggle before it was widely adopted, and the seismic shifts it helped bring about. Shifts with far-reaching consequences for workers' communities and an international economy. Our guest tonight is the author of The Box, Marc Levinson. He started out as a journalist with stints at Time, Newsweek, Bureau of National Affairs, now part of Bloomberg, Daily Journal of Commerce. He was a finance and economics editor at The Economist in London, and then he joined J.P. Morgan Chase, where he developed the company's environmental research for institutional investor clients. He's been a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and managed transportation industry analysis for the U.S. Congress. And he is an author of 7 books. I think we're going to talk about at least 2 of them tonight. Marc Levinson, Dr. Marc Levinson, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be with you.
Oh, yeah. I love doing this. It's so different from what we normally do in a show like this. And we're trying to, because I think this is a unique proposition. First, you are a historian and a journalist and an economist. That is just an amazing combination that fits really well with what we're doing here. And I love for us to give us a little bit of a deep dive into how the whole shipping container thing got started and where it led to in terms of creating the global economy.
Sure. The modern shipping container really got its start in 1956, as you just talked about. But the idea that you put a bunch of little things into a big thing and it's cheaper to transport it that way is an old one. Okay, this was not a great insight. There were shipping containers of a certain way used as long ago as the 1700s. Okay, the thing was, no one had found a way to do this economically. It wasn't financially viable. Think of it. You take some wood, you build a shipping container, you put the goods into it, you put the container on a horse cart and take them somewhere. You unload the container, take the goods out. What do you do with the container? Okay, your economics just got destroyed. You wasted a lot of money building the container, and now it's firewood because nobody's waiting for this container. And so the great insight of Malcolm McLean, who was the trucking magnate who first developed the modern shipping container, was that his customers just wanted to get stuff from here to there cheaply and reliably. They didn't really care about whether it went on a ship or a train. They didn't care whose ship it went on. And his view of the transportation industry, frankly, was that people were very wedded to their own little business. And in fact, that was the case with shipping containers. There were, in the United States, for example, shipping containers used by several different railroads in the 1930s and 1920s even. But you couldn't take a shipping container made to go on one railroad's freight cars and use it on another one. They were all custom made because everybody was afraid of losing this business. And McLean's idea was no. I mean, you can have 100% of something really small, or you can actually build a big business here. And that's what eventually happened.
Right. That's brilliant. So the real insight was just standardization across all of the platforms, railroad and shipping and trucking, all at the same time, right?
A standardization was one of the insights. The other is that while you in the maritime business or the railroad business or the trucking business may be fixated on your business, your customer is not. Your customer just wants the best way to get stuff from here to there. And so
Right.
you had better look at this from the customer's point of view rather than from the point of view of your own enterprise.
Wow. Imagine a world where space was customer centric, right? That is not how we've been operating since the 60s. So unless you count NASA as the customer, which we don't. So that's great. I like that. What were some of the things? Sorry,
go
Tom,
ahead.
were you
Go
going to say
ahead.
something? Um, what were some of the things that changed as a result of the box? Immediately and then
Well,
over
let
time.
me, I guess, explain for a minute, since probably no one who's watching this was around back in those days. But before the shipping container, I don't even believe that, before the shipping container came along, shipping of general merchandise occurred through a system that was known as break bulk. Okay, and so what break bulk meant was that individual parcels, individual packages, individual crates were put on a truck or a train, taken to a dock, taken into a warehouse, taken onto the dock, put into the hold of a ship, and each one had to be handled individually. Okay, so there was no bulk, there were individual items, and the dock workers who were down in the hold had to stow, this bale of cotton or this barrel of nails or this crate of this or that into different places. So it took forever to load a ship. A ship could be in port for weeks actually getting loaded. A lot of cargo got lost or stolen on the way. The process was extremely costly because we're paying for a lot of labor to load and unload these vessels, and it was really quite slow. So if you were shipping, say, some manufactured good from the United States to Europe, it could take you 6 weeks or more from the time it left the factory gate to the time it got to the customer in Europe. And of that time, 1 week was actually steaming across the ocean. The rest of that time was getting it into the ship and the ship waiting at the dock and getting it out of the ship at the other end. So that's why international trade really was quite limited, because using shipping was expensive and it was slow. It was generally not reliable. And so you couldn't know with any certainty when your cargo was likely to arrive. And using the ship only got you as far as the dock. Then you had to arrange somehow a train or a truck to take it on toward the destination and pay separately for that. Like you couldn't, there was not
Right.
what they call today a through bill of lading, where you could just pay once and the whole journey is taken care of. So it was a complicated process. It was a time-consuming process. It was a very expensive process. And the result of it was that a lot of stuff just didn't get traded.
Okay.
The shipping container really changed that picture. And
Yeah.
as it cut costs a lot and improved reliability, suddenly things that hadn't been sensible to trade became sensible to trade.
Okay. I wanted to ask you because you said that this whole system took about a decade or more to kind of catch on.
Yes.
Was that a reasonable amount of time, or was there institutional inertia slowing it down in the process?
Well, both. Okay. Again, you have to project yourself back into a different world.
Mhm.
The companies that were in the maritime business a lot of them were using leftover World War II ships that the US government had sold for little money or had just given away. So they had very little by way of fixed costs. They were trying to use use these vessels. The vessels were not well suited to shipping containers because they were not designed for that. Just envision being in the hull of a ship. Okay, guess what? It's curved on both sides. Shipping containers are not.
Yeah.
So now you've got this box. You're going to put it somewhere in the ship, and now you've got dead space. Okay, because your box doesn't fit with the ship. So yes, maybe the box itself is more efficient, but maybe the ship is not.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of concern about how the system is going to work on the ocean, and there was a lot of concern about the broader transportation system. One of Malcolm McLean's insights really is that all the pieces had to fit together, and if container shipping were just about the ship, it wasn't going to go very far. So there was a lot of innovation that had to take place beyond the container. For example, in the early days, containers were often lifted with forklifts, or sometimes they were lifted with shipyard cranes. The crane would hang down four cables, and then a dock worker had to climb on top of the container and put a hook into four eyes on the top of the container, and then climb down again. And then the container would be lifted onto the ship, and then the dock worker had to climb up on top of the container again and unhook those four hooks. Real efficient. So a lot of things had to happen before the shipping container actually became a widespread means of transportation.
It was still like that in 1987. I was in the Marine Corps, and we were loading a ship that was going from Japan to Korea. This is the U.S. Navy. This is not a commercial vessel. And we were all scrambling around on the docks, loading, hooking and unhooking. That was in 1987. It was still like that for a long time, because you can't just throw away the old ships, right? Whatever was moving cargo from Newark to London in 1955 was still being used by 1970. And so you're building new fleets to accommodate the new technology behind the containers. And that means changing the ports. So it's I wouldn't say it's inertia, it's more there's inherent infrastructure that needs to be updated.
There's infrastructure. You have to invent things that you didn't know you needed in order to handle containers efficiently. Nobody worried about those things because there were no containers. The key element, though, turned out to be the standardization of the container. And the reason for this is that in the early days, as the original container got put to use in various ways, other companies came into the business. They tried containers of their own. And so out on the seas, you had 35-foot long containers, and you had 24-foot long containers, and you had 17-foot long containers. And of course, you couldn't put a 24-foot long container onto a ship that was designed for 35-foot containers. So this was a problem. Most of the early container ships were vessels that had been built years previously and had been adapted for this. And so there was a need for new vessels, but there was no investment. And the reason there was no investment is because the smart money was sitting on the sidelines. The smart money didn't know what size container they should build ships for. And so they decided to wait it out and wait until there was agreement on a standard. There were international negotiations, and in the mid-60s, there were finally international agreements through the International Organization for Standardization about how long a shipping container should be, how wide a shipping container should be, what the pieces that go at the corners to lift it by crane should look like. Once those sorts of things were agreed, then there was a flood of money that went into the industry. Okay, because now people could build a ship and be confident that it would work, and be confident that their ship would not be stranded because they'd guessed wrong about what containers would look like.
Okay, well, how long did that take? You anticipated my next question about standardization, because
Right,
that's
yeah.
how, of course, that's how it's going to have to work. We're going to have to do that in the future as well, because we started out with the lowly new old shipping container and the old ships. Now we're building new ships, and we're coming up with standards for the containers and presumably standards to hoist them and standards to carry them on a truck. How long did that take? Where are we in the timeline at that point?
It took about a decade. So the first modern container voyage was in 1956. Very soon thereafter, the U.S. Navy was really concerned about this. The U.S. Navy didn't know anything about containers, but it had the right to commandeer a lot of U.S. flagged ships in time of war. And the Navy said, so what do we do? We've got ships that are designed for 17-foot containers and ships that are designed for 35-foot containers. Suppose we have an emergency. We need to commandeer these ships, but how do you fight a war when you've got all these different sizes and one container won't fit aboard another ship? And so basically, the command went down from the US military, come up with a standard container. We want you guys to fix it. If you don't, we will. And that was the beginning of negotiations that went on for a dozen years. It was really about 1965 before there was agreement on a lot of the basic aspects of the container. And in the end,
Sorry, what year?
1965.
Sorry, what year?
So it took
65.
eight
Okay.
or 9 years for the different standards to take effect. You have standards for things like how the doors should open and where they should be located. You have standards for things like should there be holes for the forklift under the container or not. You should have standards for things like how many supports should there be inside the container. And you can imagine the controversy. Railroads didn't care if there were supports inside the container. Ship lines did because they wanted to be able to stack containers, and so their internal strength mattered a whole lot. And I really consider that the heroes of the container story were actually the engineers who spent 10 years in smoke-filled rooms talking about things like the strength of container end walls and the location of the supports inside the container. It's really fascinating stuff, and for some people, they saw it through, and at the end of the day, they had an agreement that really opened the way for a lot of private sector investment and made international container shipping a reality.
But also opened the way for just a huge booming of the global trade economy. Can you go into a little what happened, what that did, how it opened it up, and maybe the general size
Hang on
of
a
how it
second.
grew?
Sure.
Hang on, just 1 second, sir. One of our frequent audience members, Dr. Plata, Doug Plata, is a medical doctor. He was asking to go a little bit deeper in standardization. So before we move to the next piece, Tom, I don't want to lose your question, but I want to stick in the standards topic for just a second. You talked about the engineers. How, if the Navy was kind of the catalyst for it, who were some of the beneficiaries? Who were some of the folks that kind of succeeded and won from those standardizations?
Well, initially, the standardization really opened the floodgates. The economics of container shipping were, of course, not very well understood. And so you had a lot of companies trying to compete in this business. You had, in some cases, ship lines forming alliances because they independently did not think they had enough money to actually build a fleet of container vessels. So maybe if they joined forces with one or two other ship lines, founded a joint venture, they could afford to do this. So many companies went into the business, but scale increased greatly and the cost of building these vessels increased greatly. So it was pretty clear pretty soon that not everybody was going to, stay in the game. An
Right,
example of how the economics developed in ways that people really hadn't anticipated. In the breakbulk ship era, there were actually vessels that were known as tramp ships. Okay, they went in search of cargo. They'd sail from here to there because they got an order, put that stuff in the ship. Then they heard there's more cargo down the coast, so they'd sail there, and then they'd sail across the ocean. And when they got there, they got there. But it turned out that container shipping wasn't like that at all. Container shipping was going to work on a rigorous schedule. And that meant that you needed a lot of ships because nobody was interested in putting containers at the dock and waiting until a ship bound for Rotterdam might come along. They wanted to know that there was going to be a ship leaving for Rotterdam every Wednesday. And that meant that you needed enough ships in your company's fleet in order to maintain a frequent service. And you needed that for every route. So there was no such thing as buying one or two ships and being in the container business. You needed to have a bunch of ships. And this became a barrier to entry. You needed a lot of capital to play in container shipping.
Okay.
All right.
So standards were the key. Sorry.
No,
go
I
ahead,
just
Tom.
because we've started out here, we've developed standards, we got these things going. What happened to the global economy after they got going? Because you kind of suggested it just blew up this big, and it created the kind of globalization that we see today.
Okay, there was a bit of a time lag, and again, this also reflects some lack of understanding of the economics of container shipping, or else, in some cases, poor predictions about how it would develop. You had companies starting to build container ships from scratch in the late 1980s, dedicated container ships. They carried nothing else because the shipping industry discovered that if you had other stuff on the ship, then it took time to load and unload it, and you lost a lot of the economies of the shipping container. So they wanted ships that only carried containers. Well, there were ships that were faster and ships that were slower. We had an oil crisis in 1973. The price of oil went up a whole lot. If you had purchased ships that went faster, that probably meant that they consumed more oil for every knot that they traveled. And now you had a problem because now you were the high cost provider, whereas a ship that sailed more slowly was more economical. It wasn't burning as much of this important cost factor. So you had companies that went out of business for that because they bet the wrong way. They'd bet on the wrong kind of vessel. International trade in general was pretty weak in the 1970s because the world economy was not in very good shape. And it was really not until the second half of the 1980s that international trade really took off. There were, in my view, three things that came together at that same time. We're talking now about 1987, roughly. By this time, you had desktop computing, so everybody had access to a lot of information right on their desk and the ability to communicate it long distances. You had the shipping container, which had brought down the cost of shipping very significantly. And you had this drop, a very abrupt drop in the cost of telecommunications. So now a company in one country could closely supervise its subsidiary in another country, or could be in direct communication all the time with a factory that was filling its order. Now you could start to create the sort of supply chains we know today. You could move cargo from here to there because you could keep a very close eye on everything that was going on in the process. And so we started to see this boom in international trade around 1987. And one of the things that was particularly noteworthy about it is that a lot of this boom involved what we call intermediate goods, okay, stuff that was made here and was being shipped there for further processing to be put into some other product. There'd been almost no international trade in intermediate goods before the container. But now, as companies built supply chains, they could do that. They could have a factory that makes this component here, and they could send those goods from that country to a different country for the next stage of production. A whole new way of thinking about the world economy. And that's the root of what we talk of today as the globalization of manufacturing.
Brilliant. I can see so many analogies to where we are in space right now. So many, right? Hyper specialization, specialty built spacecraft, specialty built launch vehicles, multi-billion-dollar systems. One of the crazy stories right now is the James Webb Telescope a couple of years ago. Crazy expensive, 20 years to develop. I think $13 billion was the price tag. And why? Because it had to origami itself, fold itself into a very specific shape. A system that's this big has to just origami itself into a smaller shape just so it could launch. And when you talk about the stevedores and the longshoremen specializing in this kind of ship or that kind of ship or this port or this cargo, that's where our industry is now. Everything, in the phrase that Space Force uses, exquisite. Everything is exquisite, which means expensive. And almost everything is custom designed. The companies that are the most successful right now, Planet Labs about 8 years ago perfected the idea of a satellite production line. Iridium tried doing it 25 years ago. That was not very successful, but Planet was able to make, they were called doves. They were small CubeSats. They were able to make a new design about every 8 to 10 months, launch it, test it, make new improvements, launch the next constellation. And so that standardization and containerization helped them get, for a little while, they were the largest satellite provider in the world because they had 200 satellites. I mean, now with SpaceX having 5,000 satellites, that seems really quaint. But once upon a time, they were a really big deal in their productization and standardization methods. So I can see so many parallels of our industry in those growing pains stages that you're just describing about, which horse to bet on. I mean, that is kind of what this show is about, is which horse to bet on in the future. And I'm going to say it's the ones that figure out flat packing, right? As one piece to that puzzle.
Yeah, well, and the ones that use brute force, like SpaceX and their
Right.
and Starship, and
Yeah.
it raises the question again. And one of our guests here on the comment board talks about now that we're moving beyond Earth, we're going to establish new worlds. Is it the time now, or is it too soon to try to set standards, like in space standards, surface transport, electrical systems? All the things you should need to do to have on the engineering side, to have a fully integrated functioning infrastructure wherever you happen to go, whether it's the moon or Mars or the asteroid belt or someplace else. Because we only have, well, the heaviest lift thing we have right now is actually commercial and working, is probably Falcon Heavy. And, as Starship isn't ready for prime time yet. It's going to be very soon now. And then that'll set a whole new standard. Then where do you go from there? Is it just going to be the big movers with the big money are going to set standards, or is it going to be some other independent body, or is another Navy going to come in? Is the Space Force going to come in someday and say, no, we need this, so you need to do that? Where do you think it's going?
Well, my knowledge of space is null. Okay, I've never been there, and I don't really have much expertise. But I think that there are a couple of aspects of the shipping container story that are really relevant here. One is that in the early days of standard setting, there were a lot of people who were trying to set standards that were not particularly suitable.
Mhm.
So, for example, one of the early standards that was adopted was that the standard size of a shipping container, the standard length, should be either 10, 20, 30, or 40 feet long. Okay.
Right.
The idea here was that you've got a certain space for the shipping container on board a ship or on board a railroad car. And so you can get a 40-foot container, or maybe you could get two 20s, or you get four 10s. And so those were the standards that were being offered. Proved to be a really bad idea. Why?
Okay.
Because while that works in terms of the geometry of the containers, it doesn't work in terms of the cost. Okay, if you have to lift the containers onto a ship, a 40-foot container is going to require one lift. Four 10-foot containers are going to require four lifts. And so your costs are going to be four times as high to get the container onto a ship and off of the ship. So there's a standard that was adopted, but nobody ever built a 10-foot shipping container because there was no commercial demand. Another hazard is one that I think the shipping industry is rather painfully aware of today. The standard size for a shipping container is 40 feet long or 20 feet long. Almost all the containers that cross the oceans are one of those lengths. And these sizes were dictated by the regulations in various countries about the length of trucks. Okay. Remember, this was in the age before there were a lot of expressways, motorways in different countries. And so, envision a truck carrying container trying to make a sharp right turn in the middle of some French village. Okay, that's
Right.
what we're talking about here. So those were the sizes that were adopted. Okay, today, most countries have pretty extended expressway networks. We see much longer trucks on the road in the United States, and the same is true in other countries. The shipping industry would very much like to have longer shipping containers, would be much more efficient. But now we've got what economists refer to as lock-in.
Yeah.
You've got this huge investment around 40-foot containers. So now you can't easily make the switch to 53-foot containers. You see this system in the United States where the 53-foot containers that are on the highway are usually not maritime containers. Okay, they only travel on the road because most ocean-going ships can't handle them. You actually have a business in some of the major US ports in which importers bring arriving 40-foot containers to a facility where they are unloaded, and the stuff is packed into 53-foot containers to save trucking costs. Okay.
Wow.
So there is a problem with being too fast to develop standards or putting in standards that can be hard to change once everybody has adopted them.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, because there's a lot of other things in history that you can point to that gives it kind of the same story. I think railroad track gauge today is
Yep.
still based on the distance between the ruts in Roman roads going back 2,000 years, and so we're still
Absolutely.
doing it.
And that was, there's a kind of popular myth about the space shuttle, the original space shuttle, had to be configured the way that it was so that the giant boosters could fit in tunnels on trains. And so, like, the space industry is hearkening back to Roman carts because that's what we got. So that's 2,000 years of lock-in there. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's crazy. That's wild.
So I guess the sense I'm getting is probably a little too early yet to start looking at what kind of long range standards we're going to set for long distance hauling to Mars or the asteroid belt by some kind of standard, shipping company, because we just don't have that technology yet. Starship is potential, but they're probably going to build other things competing with that over time. And probably in another, maybe, 30, 40 years, things will consolidate into something that's actually, usable and will stand the test of time. But not today. I'm thinking.
Well, your story is actually the story of the U.S. railroad industry,
Yeah.
which in its infancy had different track gauges.
Yep.
And what happened was there was a spate of mergers, and each time a big railroad bought up a small railroad, it reset the track.
Hmm.
So all of a sudden, this branch line the gauge was changed so it could accommodate the big railroads' cars. And over time, everything came around to a standard size, but it took a while. It was a pretty messy process.
Yeah.
Wow. Yikes. I never thought about that. I've never heard about that before. That's fascinating.
But at one time, at the end of the 19th century, there was 250,000 miles of track out there. And by the mid 1950s, half of it was rusted out. And so a lot of things replaced it in the meantime, like interstate highways and just other forms of moving things from here to there. So, so that's the other thing is you question what, just how long you hang on to something before it just reaches the point of diminishing returns.
Well, I think in any process of standardization, there are going to be some losers. Okay, people have made investments in something that is no longer the standard, and do you pay them off?
Right.
Do you say, "Oh, tough luck, sorry"? Do you say, "Well, we'll give you a tax break to replace it"? There are different ways to approach this. And I think it's a bit more complicated now than in the early days of the container, because back then, the negotiations in the International Organization for Standardization were mostly among the European countries, the United States, Canada, Japan. The rest of the world really didn't participate. These days, that would be quite different. You'd have a lot of countries that want to be involved in the negotiations, and each one probably has its own pieces of the industry that it wants to make sure don't get hurt.
Yep, that's definitely true. Machiavelli is always talking about entrenched interests always win, right? You have to work triply hard to work past entrenched interests.
Absolutely.
And I feel like if you're a developing space nation, Australia has a developing space program, Mexico has one, Brazil's been around for 20 years, but they're upping their game. There are probably 30 new space agencies in the last 10 years. That's probably not an exaggeration. There's probably 30 in the last 10 years. Whereas entrenched systems like European Space Agency, America's NASA, even India's ISRO or China and Russia, they definitely have first mover advantage, and they can set standards. But even amongst the global space powers, there's not a lot of cooperation. One of the marvels about the International Space Station was it was a treaty between multiple nations, and one of the things they had to figure out was what size bolts are we using, that sort of stuff. So yeah, there are entrenched powers in this system already, but there are so many new entrants into this market that I don't know that the old powers are going to be able to maintain their position. So it's curious to see where that goes.
Which raises my last question. We're a couple minutes away, but I wanted to get this in because you also wrote kind of I don't know if I'd call it a follow-up book. It's called Outside the Box or Out of the Box. And you were mentioning there are some new challenges to the system as a whole that seem to be, they're undergoing some evolution, and there's some resistance to that and some breakdowns here and there because of that. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. This Outside the Box, despite its name, was not a sequel to The Box.
Yeah.
But it was really talking about the development of supply chains and how they changed, and in particular, why international trade and international investment as a share of the world's output peaked in 2007, 2008. And a lot of people are not aware of that, but we had a period when international trade grew twice as fast as the world economy. And that ended in 2008 and has not increased since then. And there's a couple of reasons for that I highlighted, one of which is that the companies that engaged in international trade really systematically misunderstood the risks. In building their supply chains, they were mostly concerned about production costs. This was really bean counter dominated. Okay, if we can make that thing 5 cents cheaper in this country rather than in that country, factor in a little bit for shipping costs, and if it's cheaper to get it into the United States than what we make domestically, we will outsource it. And so every company in manufacturing and a lot of companies in retailing made these sorts of decisions, and they didn't account for the risk that the stuff doesn't get delivered on time, which is a substantial risk. Okay, you have hurricanes, you have earthquakes, you have strikes, you have all kinds of things that come up, and I think that a lot of companies realized they hadn't embedded enough, and they hadn't made the proper accounting for risks, okay, in their supply chains. The other thing that happened is that the shipping industry was absolutely transfixed by scale. Okay, the original container ship had 58 boxes, and year after year, the average container ship got bigger and bigger and bigger. And
it's 11,000 now.
Well, now the biggest ships on the sea can carry more than 12,000 40-foot containers. Okay, so it's a quantum difference. But what the industry hadn't really considered is that these really large ships, these mega ships, had some disadvantages. Okay, they take longer to load and unload, so they actually slow down the time the ship spends in port, which is expensive. Okay, it's an axiom in shipping that when your ship's in port, it's not making any money. And if you've got all those boxes to move on and off, you've got a lot of time not making any money. It's a problem in the port because now there are fewer ships calling, but each ship is bigger. So all of a sudden there's all of this cargo being delivered at one time. How do you get it out of there? How do you get all the trucks and trains into the port to deliver cargo for the outgoing ship and take the cargo away that's just come in? This is a big problem. And so a lot of trade has been snarled, and in general, international trade became much less reliable after the aughts. In the 20 teens and in more recent years, ships have run behind schedule more frequently. Shipments have been late. It's a lot harder to promise that these goods are going to arrive on a certain date because there are a lot more problems in the shipping process. And this is a function of scale. I think what you've seen on the shipping side, the maritime side of the industry, is that while bigger ships were better to a certain point, a lot of the companies that decided they wanted to build giant ships, the ones that can carry the equivalent of 10 or 12,000 40-foot containers, many companies have decided that's not a terrific idea.
Yeah.
They take too long to load and unload. Oh, and by the way, if markets change, a lot of ports can't handle these giant ships. And so we're seeing more interest in ships that are not so big, but a lot of people made expensive mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's expensive lock-in.
This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm glad we did it. We added some unique value this evening for our viewers and listeners. My God, this has been this mind-blowing program. But I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time afterward, and how we can not make the same mistakes that we've done on the oceans, and do something different, which we're going to have to do anyway, because we're going out farther and faster and further, and probably carrying even more stuff out there and back again someday. Dr. Marc Levinson, economist, historian, journalist, and obviously Renaissance man. Thank you so much for being with us. We just really enjoyed having you.
Thank you for having me. I learned an enormous amount about space, and I really appreciate that.
Great.
Great. Thanks very much, sir. Bye-bye.
Okay, just a last little wrap up here. We're done. As we mentioned earlier, we're getting very, very aggressive with our programming here at the Unknown Quantity. It's spelled TUQ, kind of pronounced Tuk, not to be confused with a popular Canadian ski hat. But we are moving from 2 shows a month to 2 shows a week. So look for us again Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, and again on Tuesday the 11th of March. I'll be doing a remote cast from the Satellite 2025 conference in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday the 11th. On this coming Thursday, we'll be speaking with the winner of February's micro grant, Joe Luttrell from Cube Inc. And from Satellite Conference, we'll also be talking with Marcella Bolt from the Space Generation Advisory Council and all the plans that we have for the Space Generation Congress in Sydney in October. And on that note, from the news desk at the Center for Space Commerce and Finance, thank you from Michael Lane. My name is Thomas Andrew Olson, and keep watching the skies.